All right, so let's start. My name is Surya Deva. I'm a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this closing plenary. We have a very distinguished panel of experts sharing their thoughts about the forum and the way forward. And before I invite them, let me say a couple of words about the context of this particular forum. This forum is part of the working group's regional strategy to build capacity, raise awareness, and implement UN guiding principles outside the Geneva bubble. So when I joined the working group in 2016, I felt that Asia Pacific is too big and too diverse. So we have to perhaps adopt a sub-regional approach in Asia Pacific. And that was the context within which we started building capacity by workshops and all that. So last year, we started a similar South Asia forum. Before that, in collaboration with UNGP, we have been doing the forum in East Asia. That takes place every year. And now this is the third sub-regional or regional approach in Asia Pacific. We're starting this with the Pacific countries. That is the context. Of course, the objectives are multiple, but basically we would like to raise awareness about the international standards, how we can connect UN guiding principles with sustainable development goals, how can we facilitate peer learning, encourage multi-stakeholder dialogues which are solution-oriented. And this journey basically started when I visited Fiji in May 2017. And after that visit, I realized that much more work needs to be done in this part of the world. Otherwise, we cannot achieve really the goal of leaving no one behind. So that was the context within which we started collaborating closely with the Office of the High Commissioner for the Pacific region. We did 3 workshops, 2 in person in Fiji, 1 in PNG, and we did a 4th workshop this year virtually to build capacity. So that is the context within which we are doing this forum. As a way forward, I do not want to preempt what my distinguished panelists would like to say, but Working Group and the Office of the High Commissioner are committed. This is not the one-off event. We are committed. This is the beginning of an end. We want to work together and encourage the states and businesses to ensure that the UN guiding principles are implemented. And if there are proper incentives and disincentives, and if there are businesses who are not respecting human rights, then there is a system of corporate accountability. With that particular context in mind, let me start with the first speaker that we have. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Simona Marinescu. She is the UN Resident Coordinator for the Resident Coordinator's Office. Simona, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surya. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. Distinguished participants, dear colleagues, it is indeed with great pleasure that I join you in this panel discussion. I've been able to listen in to some of the sessions prior to this one, and I would like to congratulate the OHCHR and the working group on a great event. It's been extremely informative, and I think the private sector has demonstrated great knowledge when it comes to the body, the content of the International Bill of Rights, as well as the practices that would adopt the rights and would respect everyone's rights in the workplace. But let me just say from the very beginning that for the United Nations, the private sector is a strategic partner. That's how we look at the business community. We are mindful of the fact that business actors are critical in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 Agenda. We all draw on the resources of the same planet. There is no other way that we can build a sustainable system without working together. Human rights are not optional. That's the second message that I wanted to make, and we are all aware of that. Our countries are signatory parties to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, to the International Bill. We hear more countries in the Pacific adopting the the social and economic and cultural rights covenant, which is a critical part of the transformation we want to see. So overall, we are all committed to the full implementation of the Bill of Rights, and to, again, recognizing everyone's fundamental rights and freedoms. Very importantly, in this strategic partnership that we have with the private sector, the United Nations believes that through everything we do, we practically de-risk private investments. By contributing to creating more conducive business environments, by ensuring that there is strong rule of law, we ultimately facilitate the expansion of businesses and the pursuit of their particular objectives. What we want to see is a transformation in the business behavior at the time. We can no longer pursue businesses just focusing on maximizing our profits. There have been extensive discussions on that. I just want to make a few points as to how I see the way forward. We talked a lot in the United Nations about the importance of corporate social responsibility some years back, when we thought that that was the only way that businesses could contribute to development. Through the UN Global Compact agenda, we managed to make one step forward and realize that corporate social responsibility is no longer the answer to the way we want the business community to contribute to social development. We need to see a fundamental change into the business model that is being adopted across sectors, regardless of the size of the businesses. To see businesses that are more inclusive, businesses that know how to integrate poorer communities, either as suppliers of labor or suppliers of entrepreneurship, and businesses that again are very mindful of the impact that they make on the environment, the consumption of resources. So all those changes are supposed to be adopted by the business community to become that kind of strategic partner that we believe the businesses should be. There is a lot that businesses could innovate around by making their business model more inclusive. And I would like to suggest that a report that we issued some years back, the dedicated Global Center of the United Nations for Private Sector in Development, which is called Barriers and Opportunities at the Base of the Pyramid, that presents the private sector with a wide range of business ideas that again could grow into poorer markets, into communities that are not necessarily well off, that would generate social benefits while also again pursuing the business goals themselves. There is a lot that businesses can learn from reverse technology and reverse innovation, a huge body of literature around that. And we very much encourage the social entrepreneurs attending this session to just go read and identify solutions that would work in the markets in the region. There are very few interesting points that were made in the first session with respect to the nature of the law system in the Pacific, the combination of customary law with common law that presents some challenges for the business sector. And I just want to inform that the United Nations does work with countries in the region on reconciling those two systems of law and primarily promoting a change that would enable countries to advance their sustainable development agenda while recognizing rights across. And because we are talking about where to move from here, I just want to share a few solutions that we think would be extremely important for us to have a trust-based partnership with the business sector and the business sector with the United Nations, with governments and with other actors in the society. When we engage with the private sector, when the United Nations is willing to have a partnership, an actionable partnership with the private sector, what we request the private sector to do is to adopt our social and environmental standards. Social and environmental standards and safeguards in the United Nations put together a series of principles on human rights, on gender equality, and on environmental sustainability. They are very much at the heart of what the UN Global Compact is about. But again, we talk about a very specific set of social and environmental safeguards. And while we pursue our partnership, we expect the private sector to continue to respect and to integrate those principles into their business model within the partnership and beyond. We also have a system of compliance auditing in situations in which the private sector, through the partnership, does some harm. affecting rights of indigenous communities, affecting rights of people in the environments in which they operate. So we do offer a remedy to such situations, again, with a very open, again, transparent system. What we want to see is that the set of social and environmental standards that we talk about are now being adopted by governments in everything they do in their public investments and within the value chain by the private sector as a very fundamental, again, step forward towards ensuring that we all contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. That would clarify the way we engage, that would allow us, again, to be very transparent on the way we work. And that would also, should banks be part of that, and many banks are part of that, would ensure that every dollar that is being invested carries the safeguards, carries the principles, and is more likely to contribute to the implementation of the SDGs. Those standards are nothing different than the guidelines that OHCHR put forward for businesses. But what I'm talking about is creating a system in which those safeguards, again, are being adopted across and would govern our partnerships and the way we work together to promote sustainable development. There is no, ideal solution as idealistic as we may be to ensure that such behaviors change overnight. I do not think that ensuring that laws and regulations have stronger teeth would solve the problem. We do talk about a transformational partnership that we should be able to embark on together. The private sector has a lot to contribute. The private sector has a lot to learn. And I heard the private sector speak, and I think that willing to learn mode is already there. We encourage the private sector to reach out to the United Nations. There's a lot that we can share again on inclusive business models, just to give a very simple example, but also to explain how we create a better environment for businesses to grow in a way that benefits the community, in a way that also supports their goals. And I'll close by mentioning that I heard in just the last panel, a young speaker talking about how important it is to move out of the mindset of being an employee to being an employer and creating jobs. And the future will change the way we work. We all know that. We could see it throughout COVID-19. There will be more entrepreneurship than just traditional employment. And we think entrepreneurial skills need to be cultivated from a very young age. We need to see schools and education systems focusing more, again, on entrepreneurial skills, on digital literacy, on financial literacy. Those are the sets of the knowledge that our younger generations need to be equipped with to operate in a totally new environment. So again, I think everything that was meaningful to this discussion has already been mentioned. What I would like to close with is that the United Nations in the Pacific is your partner, distinguished representatives of the business community, of the civil society. We believe that our partnership is possible and is mutually reinforcing and beneficial. Just reach out to us and try to seek solutions while engaging with us. And do not forget, human rights are not optional. Over to you, Surya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona. I would like to pick just 2 points: that human rights are not optional. And the second point is the trust-based partnership, which can bring us transformative changes in society. Excellent points. And I think that provides a good leeway to bring in a stakeholder representing businesses. So I would like to now invite Kylie Porter. She's an Executive Director of Global Compact Network Australia. Kylie, thank you for joining us despite your busy schedule and other responsibilities. And I will appreciate if you can finish your remarks in 5 minutes, because we have to leave the physical room in Suva. I very much appreciate the cooperation of the remaining panelists. Thank you. Kylie, you have the floor.
Thanks, Surya, and I will promise you that I will try and be as quick as possible. So firstly, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and to everybody at the OHCHR Regional Office in Pacific and obviously the UN Working Group. It's great to be able to attend the UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights, and obviously quite a shame that I cannot be there in person. So as Surya said, I'm the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network Australia, and I'm joining you all from Melbourne, where I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, which for me are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I won't go into who the UN Global Compact are. I'm assuming that a lot of you are familiar. I heard Simona mention us, but we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, and human rights, including labour rights, are core to our 10 principles. They're also core to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly with regard to the collaboration and innovation needed to meet those goals by 2030. So over the last 2 days, I know that you've participated in a lot of sessions emphasising how critical business action is to the realisation of a better world, and one that tackles poverty and inequality, inclusivity, and also some of the challenges that you're facing there in the Pacific with relation to modern slavery and also climate change. I also understand that you've already been introduced to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and those interlinkages between the UNGPs and the SDGs. So today what I thought I'd do is just briefly focus on the way forward by speaking about the UNGPs in the Pacific and how the UN Global Compact has been facilitating awareness of the UNGPs and what some of these considerations might be for businesses operating in the Pacific region. So as you're aware, the UNGPs are the authoritative global framework for the respective duties and responsibilities of government, but also the responsibility of business to respect human rights and to prevent human rights related harm. These principles also offer a really strong blueprint for how businesses can support the implementation of the SDGs in line with international human rights standards. And though the Pacific is doing a good job so far in raising awareness of the UNGPs and promoting the responsibility of businesses to respect human rights, there is room for growth and development. And this is particularly because of some of the challenges Pacific countries face in implementing the UNGPs. And these include things like the limited level of awareness about business and human rights standards, the exploitation of migrant workers, the disproportionate impacts of climate change, the disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence, and also unstable tourism, which has obviously been heightened through the pandemic. So to combat some of these challenges, the OHCHR Regional Office for the Pacific and the UN Working Group have obviously helped with organising these sessions like this today. And I'm sure that many of you who are attending the sessions have participated in workshops across Fiji and Papua New Guinea aimed at educating regional businesses on business and human rights issues, but also on the stakeholders and ways to implement the UNGPs. We also know that the various businesses and human rights training programs have been conducted around the UN Guiding Principles, and notably Fiji recently adopted the Green Growth Plan framework, which will really help to ratify or get a better sense of how the interconnections between the UN Guiding Principles and some of the international environmental considerations. And despite this, I think there's still a lot of room for improvement for businesses globally, including those in Australia, to work more closely with businesses in the Pacific. And this is really around helping businesses move from policy commitment to action and making sure that those commitments that they're making in their policies actually report against progress. So it's not just practicing, it's about practicing what you preach, but it's also around ensuring that there is ongoing development of those policies, that they are reviewed and they are discussed, and you look at collaborative and collective approaches to really develop and implement those policies for a long-term approach that takes a rights-based lens to it. But the reality is that businesses, and even those in the Pacific, won't be able to implement the UNGPs alone. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed our world, and it's really emphasised how connected our global society is and how easy it is for us to become disconnected. It's also demonstrated how global challenges on human rights are intrinsically linked. And in response to this, the UN Global Compact issued a special appeal for businesses to take collective action in implementing the UNGPs across the whole spectrum of the UN of the UN Global Compact's 10 principles. So those around human rights, labour rights, environment, and anti-corruption. All of our local networks, based in over 70 countries globally, have championed this special appeal. And we've translated the appeal into different languages, and we've called for action globally. In addition, here in Australia, we launched a digital guide aimed at providing practical advice on how executives and employees can understand, respect, and embed the rights of Indigenous Australians in their daily operations. And I think this guide is equally applicable in the Pacific, where there are similar challenges with how you work with local communities and the impacts that human rights can have on Indigenous communities. And I think what I'll also touch on briefly is around the issue of modern slavery in supply chains. And modern slavery is a global human rights issue, and it's one that plagues supply chains, including those in the Pacific. And by focusing on the responsibility to respect human rights, businesses can actually be able to address issues of modern slavery. They can develop mechanisms that prevent the occurrence of forced labour and human trafficking, including those associated with irresponsible recruitment, which has been an ongoing issue in the Pacific. It is also well documented that the use of third-party labour providers in supply chains heightens the risk of vulnerable workers to exploitation. And whilst in Australia, the government's Modern Slavery Act will require companies to report on how they're addressing modern slavery in their supply chain, the UNGPs actually provides the framework to ensure that companies are going to be able to respect human rights whilst they're implementing the requirements of the Australian Act. We are currently in what we call the Decade of Action at the UN, and that's in reference to our attainment of the SDGs by 2030. And next year is the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs, marking a major milestone in the move for a better world. A year-long consultation process has commenced, and within this consultation process, business are playing a crucial role, as well as the UN Global Compact. And I encourage all of those businesses operating in the Pacific to get involved and to really voice their opinions on how to improve the UNGPs. The impact of COVID-19 has also highlighted the responsibility of all stakeholders, businesses and government, to take action to ensure that human rights are respected and protected. And there is a just cause to aggressively scale efforts and investment for businesses and human rights, and to take action on that investment to ensure that we consider the rights of everyone. As we work to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we must keep human rights central to our planning. The work accomplished here today and yesterday at this forum should not stop here. Now is the opportunity for you to engage your stakeholders both on the ground in the Pacific and throughout the value chains, including those businesses in Australia, and activate the practices discussed in the forum so that we can lead to action. I hope that you've enjoyed this forum and that you're able to walk away with greater knowledge, tools, and resources, not only about the UNGPs, but about human rights standards more broadly. And please go ahead and act as our advocates for human rights, act with courage, act with hope, and implement action to ensure that we can actually tackle these problems together and improve human rights, not only in the Pacific, but more globally. I might end it there, Surya.
Thank you very much, Kylie, and thank you for underlining the need for commitment to action, and that is something taking the guiding principles from paper to practice, and raising the issue about the hope and working together. Thank you very much for that. Now let us move on to the next panelist, and this is Golda Benjamin. She is the Program Director and also looking after Asia for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Golda, you have the floor, and again, same request to you if you could finish in about 5 minutes. Thank you. You have the floor, Golda.
Thank you, Surya, and thank you once again for the invitation. The presence of government and businesses will hopefully be a sign of the commitment, the shared commitment to really build back better. And I also want to congratulate the excellent participation of the civil society organizations. It also shows the growing and committed passion of organizations to really work on business and human rights and do right for all the people, all the workers and communities in the Pacific region. So I just have 3 points. If we are talking about future agenda for BHR in the Pacific, many incredible recommendations were presented today. So I'll focus on 3. One, of course, modern slavery is very important, and we should have a commitment to constantly push companies to first disclose their human rights policy, and that is the base of our work at the Resource Center, because if we understand where they are and what their status is, then we can push for more innovative reforms in the supply chains and also work together, government, businesses, and civil society. So for example, at the Resource Center, we did a survey of tuna companies last year, and we found out that while 2/3 of the companies surveyed had human rights policies, only 4 actually had due diligence processes, and only 1 was able to define and describe it very carefully. And this is a stark data that we need to be conscious of, because it reveals the vulnerabilities in supply chains that many companies are operating without a clear understanding of where the risks are. Another fact that we found out is that of the companies that we surveyed, there were 21 companies with grievance mechanisms, but only 6 of them extend to workers and communities across their supply chains. All the other companies were limiting their grievance mechanisms to their direct workers or direct employees. That's something that should be addressed by businesses and governments alike. It could be through legislation like mandatory human rights due diligence. It could be through committed conversations in national action plans on business and human rights, because this is a business model issue, and this has to be addressed not just in terms of voluntary action, but more so about legal accountability mechanisms in place. There was a mention about social auditors as also heightening the risk actually of abuses in the supply chain. And at the Resource Center, for example, we're looking at the evolution of litigation and jurisprudence and possible legal accountability that we can attach to social auditors who are remiss in their duty to ensure that vulnerabilities in the supply chain are identified very early on. And second, in terms of having a future agenda, the just transition to a net zero carbon economy is very important, especially for a region like the Pacific. And we at the Resource Center continue to support efforts to push companies to decarbonize, and also to make sure that we support initiatives towards a just transition. And what does this mean? We're starting to look at companies operating in renewable energy and also doing extractives on transition minerals to make sure that they are not replicating the human rights abuses in these more traditional industries. So we're looking at their labor policies, we're looking at their workers' remedies and the like. And this is how we support the just transition. We have to look at how companies are operating and what legal mechanisms are available. And finally, on human rights defenders, it is very important and powerful to establish the narrative for the businesses present here today and who are committed to human rights, to the protection of human rights. We call on these businesses to have a sense of leadership and to speak up as to the importance of human rights defenders in your work, and for the governments to establish legal mechanisms to protect them. There are our constitutions, many across the world, protect freedom of expression and association, and this should be the start and the foundation of the conversation. And I'd like to be very brief because the other speakers had already covered other essential points and recommendations, but I'd like to end also with the fact that we are all gathered here today and having these kinds of important conversations reveal greatly the shared courage that we have, that things can change, and that all of us can contribute to this envisioned change. Thank you, Surya.
Thank you very much, Golda, for making 3 concrete recommendations, which we will definitely take on board and work with the Resource Center going forward, and also ending on a hope that we can, if we work together, we can definitely create a more positive society. Thank you very much once again. As you may notice from the program, His Excellency Mr. David Kabua, the President of the Republic of Marshall Islands, was supposed to speak. For some unexpected reasons, he's not able to join, but he has recorded a video of his statement. So we would like to play that video. And after that video, we will invite the final speaker, who is Mr. Ernest Gibson. So Hyun, if you can play the video now, please. Thank you.
Yahweh and greetings from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I am pleased to join you all in this closing session of the first UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. We thank the Pacific Regional Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for recognizing the need for this dialogue, especially now when the world is faced with a global pandemic affecting societies and economies at their core. We have long been aware of business' key role in social and economic development, not just the Marshall Islands, but throughout our respective countries. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought many challenges to states and businesses, and those negative economic impacts have disrupted progress towards sustainable development. RMI, fortunately, has not had any community transmission of COVID-19, but closing our borders early, although kept our people safe and avoided a much worse negative economic impact, had many other implications. It disrupted supply chains, stalled development, laid off workers, but mostly it affected business operations, both big and small. Now, more than ever, states and businesses must collectively work together to ensure progressive development during this pandemic. Today, the Pacific is faced with multiple crises: a health crisis, economic crisis, and climate crisis. These are interlinked and shared common solutions that can help us build back better, more stronger and resilient than before. The Marshall Islands sees this pandemic as an unprecedented opportunity to transform national and global economies. As we unlock public resources to fight the health and economic crisis, we must also be mindful of our actions and their impacts on the future. As we find remedies to this crisis, we need to find innovative solutions that promote green recovery, including investing in renewable energy technology, taking more advantage of the ICT resources available to capitalize on far and bigger markets, phasing out fossil fuels, and meeting commitments under the Paris Agreement to ensure people in countries that are most vulnerable to disasters will continue to enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms. As one of the world's largest tuna transshipment ports, fisheries remains a major economic driver for the Marshall Islands. Last year, the Regional Forum Fisheries Agency enacted new harmonized minimum crew standards intended to ensure the core human rights and basic dignity of crew aboard fishing vessels. While we are prepared to play our role as a port state and will need continuing assistance to build our capacity, full implementation of these standards also requires stronger political will from the full range of international actors involved. In most instances, these are foreign vessels, owners, flags, and crew, whose nations all have applications. Many of the nations involved are also close regional partners, and some are global superpowers. Our regional and national commitment on human rights in the fisheries sector is part of a wider effort to secure traceability, environmental sustainability, and compliance with the rule of law, from bait to plate. In our region, when a fishing vessel fails to comply with these basic human rights standards, that vessels' right to fish can now be revoked. We are helping to reshape the global tuna sector, but we cannot do it alone. I also call attention to ongoing work of the Davos World Economic Forum with the Global Tuna Alliance, a coalition of over 50 companies from across global tuna supply chains, which aim to stop illegal caught tuna getting to markets and seek to boost environmental sustainability and respect for human rights in tuna fisheries around the world. The Marshall Islands formally supported the Davos Forum's Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration, and we look forward to further engagement on addressing human rights and sustainability in the fisheries sector. I hope that this collaboration between coastal states and the fisheries industry players will be a textbook example of the UN Guiding's principle in action, and I look forward to compliance by distant water fishing nations active in our region. It is particularly important that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are equally applied to all nations, large and small, without exception. And further, that their application is a matter of transparent and objective accountability, that support is in implementation and not political lip service. As a member of the UN Human Rights Council, the Marshall Islands is gravely concerned over current reports of forced labor programs and business operations that violate human rights, and expects full implementation of the UN Guiding Principles by all states and businesses. As I close, I wish to take this opportunity to offer words of sympathy and support to those gravely affected by the pandemic. I also want to recognize everyone that has stepped up to assist those in need, including the international financial institutions that have really supported us during these difficult times. I also wish to commend everyone here, especially the private sector and key actors, for your dedication and commitment to this effort in addressing and respecting human rights, as well as your continued support toward the social and economic development of our region. Komoldada in Jaraman.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for sharing these important messages, which also signify a political commitment at the highest level. So we very much appreciate this. Now, let me move on very quickly to the final speaker, and this is Mr. Ernest Gibson, who is a Pacific representative of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Ernest, you have the floor, and if you can finish in 5 minutes, that would be excellent. Thank you, Ernest.
Thank you. I'll do my best. Been a strange experience in the offices for participants. I understand, first of all, everybody, all I understand that the participants have been highlighted the business and human rights aspects. I would like to focus on this notion of the futuristic agenda. We need stronger and more multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral partnerships. I work specifically on a campaign that deals with redesigning, reimagining, reforming.
I think virtually we're not getting very good sound quality. Robert, I don't know if you can do something about it. Earlier, the sound quality used to be quite good, but somehow, at least I can't hear Ernest very well.
So the UN 75 campaign, as many of you know, is but a name for a process that we can and must continue to engage with at the 85th anniversary, 95th anniversary, and 105th anniversary of the United Nations. What I'm saying is that the number is not what is important. The key element of this process is the way that we as intergovernmental bodies, as civil society, as nation states, as the private sector, and as societies work together to design and realize the future that we not only want, but the future that we need. When we talk about the futuristic agenda, whilst it does sound like we're talking about this post-apocalyptic film set in some erudite headquarters in a time just after some very poorly named war, that set into motion a series of unfortunate events that put the world into this unimaginable turmoil. And you may think that this description of the futuristic agenda is a little bit funny. But it is in fact one side of the coin, right? The decisions that we make about the action we take or don't take today will determine the story that we tell in years to come. Because that will be the film that we get to star in. No? So going back to the future that we want and need, this, at very least in my view, should be one where the center of development is people and livelihoods, where centers of power are broad and accessible. A future where social security is a given and not a privilege. That's the easy part. Deciding what we want and differentiating between what we like and don't like is actually pretty easy. Except when you're in the front of a queue at Macca's and can't decide what chicken on the Big Mac. But in most cases, the decision is very simple. What we actually find difficult is outlining the path to get there. This is difficult because the difference between theory and reality, between plans and action in them, is monstrous. We must then not only be able to read situations, make calculated assumptions, and have as many fail-safes as possible in place, we must also be prepared to troubleshoot these and change plans entirely. This work, this futuristic agenda, is about so much more than outputs and outcomes, than meetings and agendas, and events and branding guidelines. This work is about people's lives. And life is complex and messy and multifaceted and intertwined and simultaneously sad and happy. And for all these things, life is beautiful, but also extremely complicated. So the first thing we need to do is make one simple decision. And this decision is what systems and institutions do we want to give currency and legitimacy to? Do we support people-centered economics, or do we support an economic system that has failed us time and time again in more ways than one? Do we support workers' rights and their ability and their agency to engage in opportunities for personal and professional growth, or do we legitimize, whether consciously or subconsciously, a system that hinders the development and growth of those in forms of employment? Do we invest in safety mechanisms that ensure that individuals are protected, or do we understand equalities are just part of life and accept that sometimes people live harder lives? What is your number one priority? Is it people or is it profit? Once we're clear on the future we want and the types of systems and institutions we want to legitimize, then we can talk about action. I think it's important to highlight at this juncture that I am by no means an expert on all things development. So I'm not going to pretend to be able to provide you with an operating manual on how to deal with the new and complex challenges that we and our constituents face. However, I will highlight three key elements of this conversation. The first one is a shared vision. In a typical project, developers are free to shape projects however they choose, within the confines of the market and legal regulations. But private and public sectors need to reconcile our agendas. Otherwise, we're one team playing to two completely different game plans. And in the words of my desk mate Una, that is very, very smart. For those of you on Zoom, I really do hope that the tech did not break down the nuances of that sarcasm. Creating a shared vision isn't easy. It ultimately would come from consensus building processes that take careful account of the opportunities and objectives and overall goals of the community and all stakeholders involved. This mandates deep engagement between many critical players and skilled political touch, and I say this again. This mandates deep engagement between many critical parties and a skilled political touch. The second component is meaningful engagement. What do we mean by meaningful engagement? Meaningful engagement must be three things. It must be deliberate, it must be ongoing, and it must be sectoral. When we engage communities and our stakeholders, as the development sector, or as governments, or as the private sector, or as civil society, we must do so in a way that is deliberate. This looks like inviting participants to the drawing board and not just to the big fancy event at the end of it. It looks like seeking feedback and actively listening to this feedback when it's beautiful and ugly. And the last thing is around integrated approaches. A key learning from community engagement activities conducted across Fiji, but also from activities taking place in other Pacific countries, is the need to have community engagement be coordinated in such a way that it is multi-sectoral thorough, unstable, and integrated with service delivery. Since the problems that communities face are multifaceted, it makes sense that we address these in a manner that is not siloed. Communities, and we all know this, have expressed levels of fatigue, particularly with community engagement that was not secular and did not result in any form of change. A way that we can and have used to circumnavigate this challenge and manage expectations is through highlighting our role as convener, brokers, and facilitators, and the role of UN and regional youth councils play in this regard. Our strength lies in our collective convening power to bring service providers to communities and facilitate this necessary but often difficult conversation. As individuals and agencies that are in the business of coordination and not necessarily implementation, our role is to provide a space for want of a better phrase, for the right people to do their thing, because we can't do it. I'll tell you a very good story. Last month I was in Laos with a team of about 70 people representing UN agencies, government ministries and departments, CSOs, private sectors, media partners, and service providers. The unique opportunity with this integrated approach meant that when we were having a conversation outside of the violence and in communities, for example, we also had a legal team and police officers there to inform communities about how they're able to not only access safety services, but also provide a level of context about what types of actions they have the right to be free from. But also as conversations progress, looking at access to social services, community members have access to information, but also the ability to question service providers about the quality of the delivery that is being experienced. We must never be afraid to be questioned for the service that we provide, because otherwise we have something to hide. The long and short of it is that we work together as a team and not as competitors. I leave you with one question. What systems and institutions do we, as individuals, as organizations, and communities, give currency and legitimacy to? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernest, and my apologies to those who are joining virtually that because of some technical issues, we could not hear him. Perhaps we can circulate his speech later on. So that concludes the closing plenary of the first UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. Let me just quickly thank the Office of the High Commissioner for the Regional Office for the Pacific for their collaboration with us, with the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. I would like to admire the leadership of Heike and Thomas, and of course, all the hard work done by Robert, Hugh, and Catherine, Samita, and all the colleagues in the Regional Office. We look forward to working with you and all other partners. Thank you very much, all the participants, and we appreciate the feedback. Let us work together to create a more inclusive and better societies all over the world. Thank you once again. Bye for now. Stay safe and take care.